All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Syracuse University and the Newhouse School. My name is Ellen James Mbuke. I'm the Director of Media Relations at Syracuse University. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you today to The Public Has a Right to Know How Experts Use Foia Requests to Tell the Inside Story. The event is sponsored by the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, or otherwise known as TRAC, and the SI Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. Today, we'll be hearing from the three top Foia experts: Kimbriell Kelly from the Los Angeles Times, Jason Leopold from BuzzFeed, and David McCraw from the New York Times. Austin Coker, Research Assistant Professor with TRAC, is our host for the discussion. Now, as someone who is responsible for monitoring media about Syracuse University, I see on a daily basis how TRAC's research finds its way into countless news stories. Its data is instrumental in telling stories and contextualizing trends and helping to put into wider view the impact of the human experience, from immigration to incarceration. Now, before we get started, I want to remind everyone to please put questions into the chat. And if you see your question has already been asked, vote for it with a thumbs up. And also, today's talk will be recorded and uploaded to the Newhouse YouTube channel later on. Now, I would like to introduce Mark Lodato, the Dean of the Newhouse School at Syracuse University. Dean Lodato came into the job in July 2020 and hit the ground running, despite the challenges of a worldwide pandemic. In his first month on the job, he led the successful reopening of the Newhouse School after nearly 6 months of remote instruction. He has worked to build open lines of communication with students, establish industry partnerships, and expand academic and career opportunities. He's also secured the transition of our Syracuse NPR station, WAER, into the Newhouse School, and also established a major scholarship program to support the recruitment and retention of students from underrepresented groups. Dean Lodato came to the Newhouse School after more than 14 years at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, where he was an associate dean. Dean, if you're ready, would you like to say a few words?
Ellen, of course, I would enjoy the opportunity, and thanks so much for that nice introduction. I just wanted to briefly welcome everyone to, I think, what is an important discussion in our field today and in our space. The Newhouse School is a proud institution that relies heavily on journalism and what we do, and are strong supporters of the efforts of those who care deeply about Foia and finding the truth and using the tools that we have available as citizens in a democracy to better enlighten the citizenry. So this is a wonderful discussion to have, and I am here to give my support on behalf of the school and my thanks to all of our panelists who are joining us today. It is an exciting time to be in the space of communications and journalism, as we all know, and the Newhouse School intends to be at the forefront of thought leadership as we all look more closely as to what our future looks like for journalism and communication in the United States in the years ahead. And TRAC is one area where we're able to lend a hand, so to speak, and we're happy to support the organization's efforts here on campus. And I think you'll hear a lot from us in the years ahead. We have as many as 16 faculty openings over the next 2 years that we will be looking to fill with the next generation of communications educators. And perhaps there are some who may one day be interested in applying, taking part in today's event. So with that, Ellen, I will turn it back over to you and the rest of the team. And like many in the audience, I'm excited for the conversation we're about to hear. So thanks so much for letting me say a few words.
Thank you, Dean. And likewise, I can't wait for the conversation. So without further ado, I'll introduce our host, Syracuse University Research Assistant Professor, Austin Coker. Key areas of Austin's research at TRAC include federal immigration detention, enforcement, deportation, the immigration court system, and trends within the federal, criminal, and civil courts. So Austin, I hand it off to you, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ellen, and thanks to everyone for joining us. We have really got more positive feedback than we even could have imagined, with almost 600 people registering for the event today and are currently flowing in. So on behalf of TRAC and Newhouse, I just want to welcome the panelists today. I'm really excited to get to talk to some of my heroes in the Foia world, Jason, Leopold, David McCraw, and Kimbriell Kelly. So I'm a research assistant professor at TRAC. I'm a geographer. As Ellen said, I study immigration enforcement and the immigration system, as well as other key areas of federal law. And of course, Freedom of Information Act plays a big role in the work that we do in TRAC and my own research as well. It's also notable that this week is Sunshine Week, when we focus on celebrating the work of the great Foia champions that we have on the panel, as well as highlight the work that we still need to do to improve the public's access to government information. So the Freedom of Information Act allows any of us to request records from the government under the presumption of transparency. However, in practice, FOIA requests often face long delays. FOIA requesters may get only a fraction back of what they actually asked for. And increasingly, FOIA requesters are forced to go to court to get the documents that they are entitled to. Moreover, this particular panel comes partly out of a recent study that we did at TRAC, published through the Foia project, where we found that the news media, both journalists and news organizations, are a major player in the world of FOIA, and that they are growing in terms of their impact. In fact, we looked at federal FOIA cases. These are cases that are litigated under the Freedom of Information Act in federal court. We looked at those cases going back to 2001 and found that FOIA lawsuits have grown dramatically from news organizations in recent years. There are 700 total cases since 2001. And 122 in 2020 alone, by far the highest year, the most number of FOIA cases in federal court filed by news organizations and journalists. So today we're going to be discussing some of these issues with three of the most recognized FOIA champions in the news media world. Kimbriell Kelly is Washington Bureau Chief at the Los Angeles Times. She was previously a reporter in the investigative unit at the Washington Post and was part of the team that won a Pulitzer Prize for the work that they did in 2016, documenting the number of fatal police-involved shootings. Her 2016 series on housing disparities in Prince George's County won a Salute to Excellence Award from the National Association of Black Journalists, and many of you have told me that you know Kimbriell Kelly from some of her videos online, where you have learned from her about Freedom of Information Act. So welcome first to Kimbriell Kelly. Thanks for being here. Second, Jason Leopold is an Emmy Award nominated investigative reporter at BuzzFeed News, which was part of a team that was a 2018 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting. His FOIA work has been profiled all over the news. I'm sure that if you're here and have an interest in FOIA, you know Jason. Politico referred to Jason as perhaps the most prolific Freedom of Information requester, and both Jason and David McCraw, who is here, both either represent or belong to news organizations that we have featured in our top 10 most active FOIA litigators. And in 2016, Jason was awarded the Freedom of Information Award from the Investigative Reporters and Editors and was inducted into the National Freedom of Information Hall of Fame. So welcome to Jason. And last but not least, David McCraw, Senior Vice President and Deputy Counsel for the New York Times. I am really happy to see that David recently published a book, Truth in Our Times, Inside the Fight for Press Freedom in the Age of Alternative Facts. Really fantastic book, and I encourage you to check that out. That takes a look at David's first-person experiences inside the legal battles that have shaped the New York Times coverage of Donald Trump, Harvey Weinstein, national security, and a whole range of issues. And David is absolutely an expert on that. So we're very lucky to have David here. David, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Great to have you. Let's just get into it. I know that everyone is eager to hear from your experience. So let's just start off. We'll just dive into the first question I have. So each of you on the panel has a rich portfolio of expertise and experience with filing Freedom of Information requests, with litigating under FOIA, and especially for the panel today, using Freedom of Information Act is part of a broader strategy to share important news stories to the public about how the government works. So I'd love it if you could start by just describing how you got into work under the Freedom of Information Act and how you find yourself using FOIA requests to drive your work. Maybe describing a little bit more about how FOIA works into your job working at news organizations, and maybe highlight some of the successes that you've had recently around FOIA. I'll just arbitrarily, we'll start with Kimbriell, and we'll go then to David and then over to Jason.
I will say I kind of started accidentally in the world of FOIA. And when I say FOIA, I think there's the Federal Freedom of Information Act, which of course doesn't govern what happens at the state level. And so then there are state public records laws that govern that. So I started out in my early 20s when I filed my first FOIA. Actually, it was a local public records request. It was for a park district in the community. I think I was like 23 or 24 at the time. And so I wanted to try it out. And I wanted something very basic. I wanted to see the chlorine levels, I believe, in like the local pools to see if they were toxic, right? I just had this question, right? Is this happening? You heard this tip, from residents and such. And I had such a horrible experience, let me tell you. I sent the public records request. And if anybody knows about beat reporting and local level reporting, like you work with your officials so often that they could get a little too comfortable. So when they see something like this public records request that's written with this very like legal language, they get scared off. So instead of like just receiving my records, the first thing I got was like pushback from the spokesperson. And I remember her saying, "I thought you liked us." And I thought, that has nothing to do with the law. Like the law allows me to ask these questions and to get these records. But I was young and I didn't have a lot of people at my organization who had been filing public records requests. And so I would say, like, what I ended up doing was backing off. I was scared. Here was this government official, like nervous and afraid about what I was doing. And she was kind of like getting loud with me on the phone. And so I backed off, but that lasted only a couple of years. Once I got more courageous and I realized this is a law, this is something that has been guaranteed. I don't have to tell a person what my story is. I don't have to be buddy-buddy with you. You can be my source. And that has nothing to do with me getting the records and holding government accountable. So once I got that under control and I got my mojo back, then I just started filing requests at that point. And I've been doing so for the last 20 or so years. I just dated myself. And obviously that's kind of served me well. And I like to say two main things. Like I realized that FOIA, I've had a lot of FOIA failures, but it's my FOIA failures that have led to my FOIA successes. You have to keep doing it over and over again. It's like sharpening a tool. And I'm grateful for those experiences because they got me to where I am today. And where I am today is like, I have been able to do file public records work that led to high impact work. Like you talked about the fatal force. I worked with Kimbriell Kelly at the Washington Post and Wes Lowry and a host of other people and Stephen Rich. And we worked on this entire series that ended up winning the Pulitzer, but we were taking a look at prosecutions of law enforcement, like answering this question, like are officers held accountable? Like there were all these officer involved shootings, but at the end of the day, do any of these cases lead to convictions? And we found out, no, actually very few lead to convictions. And of the thousands of officer involved shootings, only 4 actually led to some sort of criminal charge, and even far fewer led to a conviction. And so I've seen success with that, and that's led to successes with on the federal level and on the local level.
That's powerful. Thank you.
Thanks, Austin, and thanks to everybody at Syracuse for setting this up. I think the last time Jason and I were on a panel together was at Villanova. We just filed essentially matching lawsuits, different districts, trying to get access to national security information that Donald Trump had tweeted about, apparently unaware that it was a secret. We come to you today having both lost those cases at the appeals court, so we both feel outraged and right. And that's what it is. That's what it is for all of us doing FOIA. We spend a lot of time feeling outraged and right. But Kimbriell's right that the failures, we learn a lot from them, and part of it is just to keep going. And that I was one of the things I'd really stress to people is that you can't focus on the cases that didn't go well for you or the requests didn't go well for you. You learn and you just keep at it. I got into this more than 15 years ago when I first came to the New York Times, and David Barstow and Lowell Bergman were working on a story about worker safety that ultimately won the Pulitzer Prize. But they were interested in a particular statistic that the Federal Labor Department put together, which measured the most dangerous places to work in the United States. And the Labor Department would release the list, but would not tell you who was first and who was 10,000. Okay. Which, by the way, if you're a worker going to work in a factory, matters to you. Like, you're much more likely to want the job at the place that finished 10,000 is not good, but as opposed to the place that was killing their workers. And so I started down that trail with David Barstow, who'd filed the request, and we received this incredible letter that said that it would take the department 15 years to answer the request because they had to check with the companies and check the data and do this. And as you know, the timeframes in FOIA are measured in days, not weeks, not months, days, and let alone years. And we were fortunate to end up in front of a judge, Judge Shinlin in the Southern District of New York, who managed to read the statute, then read the letter and decide that just doesn't sound right. The Justice Department didn't help themselves by arguing that we didn't have standing to sue because they hadn't actually rejected our request yet, that they just needed 15 years to fill it. And I could come back in 15 years and when it would finally be ripe for adjudication. She didn't buy any of that, and that data is now available and has remained available. And it's a big deal for people who do OSHA stories or do OSHA compliance or who worry about worker safety. So that's how it really began for me, and it kind of ramped up from then. Just very briefly, we've talked about a lot of different cases that we've done. Probably the recent one that I'm most proud of is the release of data, county by county data on COVID, which we got an accelerated treatment for. We got the data from CDC, and our reporters did a very important story about the racial differences in COVID rates and how it was disproportionately affecting people of color. It was one of those times when you saw FOIA work the way it should have, so that's always rewarding. Obviously, there are smaller stories that I think go unnoticed, but have as their backbone FOIA, and we can talk about those as we go forward today.
Thanks, David. That's amazing work. Jason?
Thanks, Austin, and thanks for putting this on, and thanks to Syracuse, and it's great to see David and Kimbriell again. Hope you're both well. I got into FOIA the way, I would say, in a more aggressive way about 12 or 13 years ago. And it wasn't as a result of a FOIA I filed. It was a set of documents that were given to me by someone else, someone who had filed a request and received some records. And there were records that came from the Air Force. And at the time I was covering national security. And, in the world of national security, you're writing stories that are largely based on anonymous sources because everything is more or less classified and secret. So at the time I wasn't working for, a news outlet that was, that would roll off your tongue like the New York Times or the Washington Post. And so, these documents that were given to me were incredible. They basically showed how the Air Force was training nuclear missile officers on the morals and ethics of launching nuclear weapons by using religion. And there was a PowerPoint slide in here that showed Jesus on a horse holding a nuclear weapon. It was kind of odd. Anyway, I thought that this would make for an incredible story, and put the story together. And the impact was immediate. Within a day, the Air Force suspended the training that had been in place for 20 years. And then within a week, they canceled it outright. So that was a light bulb moment for me, because it showed what the power of documents, how powerful documents can be, and how the public will respond to documents, particularly documents coming from the government. It also was great because it gave me credibility. It gave my news organization I was working for, a small news organization at the time, lots and lots of credibility. And that was the light bulb moment that, I said to myself, I need more. I want more documents. And so I just kind of set off on a path to try and obtain records, particularly records at the time, exclusively sort of in the world of national security and surveillance, to try and pry those types of records loose from agencies. At that time, it was also, from there I went and just, I filed my first lawsuit, and that was for Occupy Wall Street records. And it was basically to kind of show what role the FBI and Department of Homeland Security was playing in, dismantling the encampments around the country. So it was really a powerful moment. And as Kimbriell noted, I do also try to focus on, I have lots and lots of failures. I mean, every day I'm getting, are you still interested in this FOIA request? And no matter how many times I say I'm still interested, I'll never not be interested. Or if I, get a set of records that are just completely redacted. And yet there will be moments where you just get that one record, or those, one set that just completely, tells the story that you want to tell. So there haven't been hundreds and hundreds of successes, but those failures, as Kimbriell noted, do help inform, how I file requests going forward, how our newsroom, approaches FOIA as well going forward. So we try to learn from that, and it's a never-ending battle. And to be quite honest, I truly enjoy the battle. I enjoy kind of going to war with the government. I mean, as David noted, it was such a bummer to lose this case, by the way. This case where we were both of our news organizations were trying to obtain records from the CIA about the agency arming Syrian rebels. But it was, these were righteous lawsuits. I mean, I'm glad that we, that we did what we did. So.
That it really seems like you do enjoy it, Jason. And I think all three of you, because of the work that you've done, I think there is a kind of determination and persistence that all of you have, and so many FOIA requesters have, who do this as a main part of their job. And I'd like to come back to this idea of determination and learning from your failures, and maybe ask each of you to expand on that a little bit, because one of the things that we are thinking about this week at Sunshine, because it's Sunshine Week, is this relationship between freedom of information and democracy. And I wonder, what do these FOIA failures and these barriers that each of you have faced in your career using FOIA, what do these barriers say about how well FOIA is working or not working with respect to to making the government open and transparent and to fostering democracy? And at the same time, what kinds of things have you learned over your career to help surmount those barriers, to get around them, over them, through them, and make information available? Because all three of you have worked on projects that, I mean, without that data, without the data on COVID, without the data on police shootings, without these documents that you're talking about, Jason, there would just be so many stories that the public would be in the dark about. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about that from each of you. And we'll start back at the top with Kim.
I just shared a link because I've actually gone on Twitter to share some of my failures, but also moments in which I was able to actually turn that failure into success, which is something that I think people need to think about. Like, you have to be nimble. And as soon as you have your failure, think, okay, what's a strategy that I can apply now to try something different, right? I think that there's a lot that's happening right now. I mean, things that you'll see for anybody who's, this is like nobody except for like me and Jason, who are looking to see the success rates of certain agencies, to see if the success rate is higher in appeals, or if the success rate is higher with the regular FOIA. You can see that you have likely a higher chance of success when you appeal a FOIA. But the problem is most reporters don't have that time. And as I already see the questions in the queue, you all are asking, like, how am I supposed to apply this on a daily breaking deadline? And so I think that's one thing, is like, people don't have time on their side. And so what you're seeing is it's taking, agencies are outright, in spite of the law, agencies are outright saying no, or either stringing these requests along. Two, you're quickly seeing that only the media outlets that can afford to file lawsuits or can afford to challenge these are doing so. And increasingly, that's a smaller and smaller universe. A smaller universe, as you see the vast number of requests like growing. And during the Trump administration, and also during the Obama administration, which wasn't that great as well. So you have this huge backlog in the last 4 years, which is even bigger. So the question is, like, how do you break through? So I think in spite of the law, you have these like major obstacles in the way of reporters. And so I think that people need to focus more on strategy. And I think Jason does this a lot. I'm sure David does as well, but I think people are more, they look at public records as more transactional. The law allows us to get these records. So therefore, if I ask for it, I'm going to get it. And it's a 2-point on a transaction. Whereas I look at public records requests as like a continuum. Like, there are multiple points on your continuum. There might be 20 points. And the first point might just be finding out who your public records custodian is. Like, giving yourself a little bit grace and realizing you're not, if you're brand new to this too, you're not just going to come out of the gate, ask for something and get it. But also figuring out, and David and Jason and I actually have different strategies on this, which I absolutely love, because we have our own little like spaces we work in. He asks for a ton of everything. He's going to bring the hammer and he wants it right now. And he works in like the complex track. And I feel like there are varying levels that people can have. Like, I like to work in a simple track. I like to work in a different strategy that has multiple points over time. I like to avoid having to go the route of the litigation. He goes the route of the litigation. It's nice to know that there's a aggressive public records person out there that's doing that, because I think you need both. But I think what we really need to tell people is you need to figure out what your own strategy is. One of the things that I'll point out, the successes that I've had, particularly at the Washington Post and then now at the LA Times, I was lucky enough to work on 3 major projects before I left, in each of the years before I left. The Fatal 4 series, which allowed me to exercise my skills in public records. But then immediately after that, I worked on the Fired Rehired series, where I was sending public records requests to 50 agencies, all at the same time. Try doing that. You will get really good at being bad at public records and being really good at it very quickly. And then I worked on our Murder with Impunity series, which I worked on right before I left to go to the LA Times, and that was the finalist for the Pulitzer. It was the same situation where we had like a finite set of agencies, 50, where when your goal is for, say, 3 months, you tell yourself, I'm going to call 50 different agencies and harangue them to get records. And there's a special sort of hell in getting local public records requests that is very different from at the federal level, because you're dealing with people from different parts of the country who view bureaucracy very differently. You have to be sometimes more polite in certain areas than you would in others. Don't expect to get your request at 4:59 and you file it and then somebody's there waiting for it. And so I think, one, people need to use the law and understand it better, particularly at a local level. Like, most people have never read the FOIA Act. Like, you should read it. You should especially read it at the local level. If you're looking for police records, you should see if the California Public Records Act allows you to get police records. If you just immediately go and file off a FOIA and expect to get a response, you're probably going to have a failure moment. So what I like to say is develop a strategy, exercise that strategy a lot. It's like trying to run. Like I mentioned to somebody the other day, I ran a marathon for the first time ever last year, the LA Marathon. It was awesome. It was great. this year, last week, I was like huffing and puffing trying to run 2 miles around Washington, D.C. And so if I'm not exercising regularly, and it's the same with public records, you don't get as strong as you need to be. But then the third thing is, and I think that this is super critical, like all of us, if we were given a daily reporting assignment from our editors, we would go full force on it. As you mentioned, we'd be aggressive, we'd be very persistent to do the daily stories. We need to be the same way when it comes to public records requests, particularly at the very beginning stage. Like you can get exhausted midway, but set up a system like FOIA Fridays, where every Friday or a certain day of the week, you're calling and checking on your records request, because when you lose time, you lose your leverage. And so even if you're working on a daily basis, you can be able to get records requests quickly by knowing your public records custodians, by knowing what's already been released. Like sometimes don't reinvent the wheel. Ask to see if somebody asked for this thing before. You can get something in a day. But then have a strategy for what works and just continue to do it more often. So I think that those are the big things. And then pursue it like it's a daily reporting assignment. If I told you today you had to find out the public records custodian for the OIG of whatever agency, you'd be like, well, that's very difficult. How do you know? You haven't even tried. So try to do it. Once you make that contact, hold on to that person tight for the next 3, 5, 10 years, because that's going to be the person that helps you figure out how quickly you can get something.
Yeah, powerful lessons. David, over to you.
And I would second Kim on the idea of reading FOIA as the New York Times lawyer. You can't imagine how many times I actually received FOIAs to the New York Times that people thinking the New York Times is somehow a FOIAble institution. It doesn't really apply to a private company, but nice try. So just a couple things, and obviously as a lawyer, I don't come at this quite the same way as Kim and Jason, and where they're trying to take FOIA and make it part of their reporting. But I would so underscore that the one thing we constantly stress, and we file a lot of lawsuits on behalf of reporters, both state and federal, is that you need to look at it as one form of reporting. Too often, I think people coming new to FOIA think of it the way, that's some kind of vending machine. You put in your requests and the documents are going to fall out the bottom, but it probably works like the vending machines at the Times, where you have to hit it a few times to get the thing to actually drop. And you just need to keep working it. And I remember walking in the newsroom to talk to a reporter, and the reporter was having this incredibly long conversation while I stood there and waited about vacation plans and kids and all this kind of stuff. And when he hung up, he told me he was just on the line with the FOIA officer, and he had treated the FOIA officer deep in the bowels of the Department of Defense, just like any other source, and knew her, knew when she was going to be on vacation, knew where she was going on vacation, talked about their kids and so forth. And does that necessarily lead to documents? Not necessarily, but it gives you a better chance that person is not going to treat you like someone who can be ignored or going to feel like you don't have a stake in it. I once went with a Metro reporter in New York who was starting a series on foster care to meet with the head of the agency, and who is a political appointee. And so we met, and the appointee brought his FOIA officer with him. And as a political appointee, he was promising the New York Times everything. Sure, we can get you that. Sure, we can get you that. I thought the FOIA officer was going to have to be propped back up on her chair, because these are not things that she would have promised to give to her. But it was important to create that political frame around it. And we also learned at that meeting just kind of what kind of records they had. And that allowed us to kind of jump a step to get ahead on that and know, rather than just put in a general request, put in a request saying, these forms, they're called this, here's their form number. And that can cut through a lot of the unnecessary time at your end and at the agency's end. The last thing I would say is, and this is not great strategy, it's just the reality of litigating and also appealing administratively, is that go outside the box the government's put you in. Look for information beyond the four corners of their denial. Just to give you the example, we've been litigating over the Bureau of Prisons records about Jeffrey Epstein. We started with a complete denial. Next month, we'll be in court, having received hundreds and hundreds of documents now and wanting more. But one of the things we found was they said, we can't give you his logs of visitors and calls, because once a criminal investigation started, we turned them over to the Inspector General. And so we looked at that for a while. And then we realized that we knew that other people had requested those records. And we were able to show that there was a pending request, not ours, somebody else's request, a pending request on the day that they sent them someplace else. Agencies can't do that. They can't avoid their FOIA obligations by chucking the documents off to a different agency. And we brought that to the attention of the AUSA, and he immediately wrote to the court and said, I need a little more time because I'm going to have to do a bit of a do-over here. And we come back to that over and over again of just getting outside the box. We had a case in the Southern District of New York where the government argued grand jury secrecy applied to documents, had a very broad definition of grand jury secrecy. I knew that across the hall in a different courtroom, in a different, that there was a leak investigation taking place. And I knew the criminal division of the Southern District of New York's U.S. Attorney's Office had filed a brief in there justifying their release of documents. And they thought grand jury secrecy was about this wide. Where on the civil side, they were saying grand jury secrecy covers everything. We put the government's own brief from the criminal side into the record in the civil case and told the judge, look, they can't have it both ways. It can't be narrow in the criminal side when they're defending their leaking practices, but broad over here when we're coming to the front.
Yeah, I think something you both have touched on that I think about in terms of how to conceptualize FOIA work, especially when you're doing a lot of it, like we do at TRAC, it is sort of a, as a geographer, I think of it as it's kind of a mapping project. You're kind of mapping the inside of how the state and how state agencies work. And so kind of like what Kim said, sometimes before you even file a FOIA, you really have to paint a picture. You need a map of the landscape before you know where you can go sometimes. And so, that can be even where a lot of energy, maybe even most of the energy goes into mapping the terrain before you really know what you can ask for and where you might need to ask for it. So well said from both of you. Jason?
I try to approach each FOIA request that I file as if I'm approaching an investigative story. And the people within the agencies, I hope to turn them into my sources in terms of helping guide me to the records or the record or records that I'm seeking. What system of record are these requests in? What's the record keeping system look like? Because my goal is to try to get records, as quickly as possible. And yes, my requests are quite broad because I do want everything. But at the same time, I'm trying to build, some investigative stories around records. Much like the rest of the journalism community last year when COVID hit, we were all thrown into, at least temporarily, covering COVID. And my request prior to the pandemic to agencies like the CDC, the FDA, and the other health and science-based agencies, when I would file a request, they would, get back to me and essentially put me in a certain track. What I noticed after COVID, when I would file these my requests, is that every response I received would say your request is too broad and burdensome. Every request, even if it was not broad and burdensome. Now, the FOIA says that, the requester need only to reasonably describe the records they're seeking, right? So I went to battle with them quite a bit, but then I backed off because I noticed what they wanted. They were inundated. I needed to get records as quickly as possible. And I went through this. This is sort of to your question of like, how do you learn from some of your, failures? Now, I wouldn't necessarily say these are my failures, but there's you pick and choose your battles. I went and looked at the organizational chart of the agency. I picked out the custodians that I wanted them to, records that I wanted them to search. I put, made sure that I had the time frame in. And so I tried to keep my requests as narrow as possible to sort of avoid any kind of response that would be broad and burdensome. And actually within the past year, given that COVID has at least for the better part of the year sidelined a lot of, the work that the agencies have been doing with regard to FOIA and getting us records because they can't go into the office. I've tweaked many of my requests, in terms of trying to, file requests that are very, very targeted. Still in trying to get as a broad set of records as possible. But that's what I learned. I learned that right now there is a backlog, and I have to work within that backlog. Early on, Kimbriell was noting about, yes, read the law, also read the 2016 amendments. I've noticed that agencies, fail to identify any reasonably foreseeable harm whenever they're denying requests. Always, even though the amendments say they must do that, but they don't. Again, that is something that goes into my template when I'm filing the request, reminding them of what their obligation is. But, one thing that I think is I just want to note what I learned early on was that the FOIA requires agencies to provide requesters with an estimated date of completion. And, this is something that has proved to be very important and valuable to me, even though it's just an estimated date. If I'm filing a request within a few weeks, maybe a month after I file it, I want an estimated date of completion. And is it going to take a few months? Is it going to take a few years? Because again, I am trying to build investigative projects for the most part out of, the request that I'm filing. And if it's going to take a few months or if it's going to take years, well, then that will guide me in what my next steps are. Do I litigate? What direction should I go in? Maybe I want to narrow the request. I mean, obviously, I have filed thousands of FOIA requests, but I don't litigate all of them. So have to make some decisions there. So I guess my point is that the FOIA, it's not just like I send off an email, give me all these records. It's painstaking work. I mean, just with regard to the insurrection, the Capitol riots, I must have spent a month just trying to perfect the requests, that I ultimately filed, and it's a lot of work. So it pays to kind of like invest in that time, and obviously reading, going into their the reading rooms, looking at other requests, seeing what the FOIA logs say. All of that is part of, again, my reporting bucket.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you touched on that too, because, I can say, now being at TRAC, having done FOIA work before, but, working in a place where, for the past 2 years, we file so many FOIA requests. I mean, it's a full-time job just to manage, a vast number of FOIA requests. That takes a lot of human work, and most of that is invisible and behind the scenes, but it's so important if you want to do that work well, that you find the system for managing it, which is so important. I'm going to turn it over to Ellen. We've got some fantastic questions in the chat. So Ellen, do you want to share a question with the panel?
Yes, and I just want to say there's so many great questions in the chat. So we're going to just jump right into it. So one of the top questions is, given how fast the news cycle is moving, it often seems pointless to file FOIAs to get at needed information. How can you use FOIA for breaking stories? Anybody want to jump in there and take that one?
I feel like I'm on Family Feud and trying to hit the buzzer, but so I will just comment. I have like several thoughts about this. I had a moment at the Washington Post where there was like a couple of reporters, and they're like, "No, there's no way you can get a FOIA, a federal FOIA in like less than 24 hours for a daily assignment." I said, "Yeah, I've done it a couple, I've done it a couple times," and they're like, "No way!" And I was like, "Well, yeah." And then I suggested to them how they could do it, and then they got the records in the day, and they were like totally shocked. But I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about like, most people have a beat, right? And so if you have a beat and you map out who the public records custodians are on your beat early on, you have the ongoing relationship with them. When it is time to actually send a request and you have it, you can get it on the simple track, and it's very discreet where you know exactly what you're looking for. You can get a response in a day, like literally in a day. Now, is that normal? No, it doesn't happen a lot, but it is possible. And so, yes, I'm realistic just as the next person. You're not going to be able to use this every single day. But I think also people need to think about public records differently. And Jason mentioned this also. Like, I think people think about it as like, oh, I need to get this entire database, or I need to get this, like these 1,000 pages of records. You literally, I try to encourage people to say, you can have one document, and that could be your story. And so I think people need to just kind of like reframe what they view is a story. They don't need to have an entire database or a set of documents. They can have one document to confirm something, and that could constitute a story. And so when you start building up that muscle, then it becomes a lot easier. So know your public records custodian, treat them like it's a regular source that you have, and then secondly, you have to map out, and I think that people don't do this enough. Look at the reading rooms. The reading rooms are there for a purpose to show which records have already been released. If the records have already been released, and sometimes I use Google Advanced Search, and I just change the file type to PDF, and I put FOIA and whatever my subject is to immediately see if anything's already been released and it's in a PDF or Excel file and it's already out there. Then I could just go and grab it. Secondly, look at the appeals. Like, remember what I said earlier, you have a higher success rate with appeals than you do just with people filing FOIAs. And I think part of that is because a lot of the FOIAs that are filed are just bad FOIAs. So the appeals, you have like the success rate, but you should go and see, I've told reporters to do this. In your spare time, if you are covering a beat, go to your agency, see not only what they're releasing, and you can request those same documents, particularly if it's from lawyers, it's free. Like, they've already paid for this stuff. It's going to take them years to go through it. They're litigating cases that are probably unrelated to daily stories. Mine those data sets that are already publicly available for stories, and those become your daily stories. But then on top of that, you really have to study. It's almost like being a student. Study what isn't working. So I don't just focus on what the agency released. I try to focus on what didn't they release. And what was their explanation? Because you need to take a lesson from both. So if you have a better understanding of your agency, who the players are, what they're releasing, what they're not releasing, an understanding of the law. When you go in and that daily assignment happens, you know exactly what to ask for. You know who to go to, and you know what the likeliness is that you're actually going to get the records.
Great. All right, I'm just going to keep pushing through the questions because we have a lot. So thank you. That was a great answer. And let's see. What if you need regular reporting of data over time? Is there a way to establish data feeds or exchange with government entities via FOIA? Anybody else want to take that on, or?
I'll pass that over to Kimbriell because I know you request lots of data, and I'm not, that type of requester.
That is a certain type of requester. I am Anu, actually, at the Washington Post on their political enterprise team, is a really great requester in terms of that, because she has ongoing requests. That is not for sure within my wheelhouse, but if you know Anu or find her email address, for sure reach out to her. But I have stuff that I request. I mean, that sounds like it's like you want something ongoingly and you want to just put a request in and get it on a rolling basis. I never really had to do that, so I can't really answer that. I've had to ask for things like year after year, or maybe 1 month to the next month, so I just put another request in. So I don't have anything on a rolling basis.
Yeah,
Okay.
the agencies have an affirmative duty to, if things have been requested 3 times, to post them in the reading room, and people are now starting to try to do that with data, enforcing that affirmative obligation. Otherwise, I think Kim is right, is that you're left to make the new request in the hopes that once they get that, once it dawns on them that you're going to make that same request over and over again, that they just say got it, and we're gonna make it available through the reading room.
Great, thank you both. Now we have a really interesting question here from not the journalist side, but the agency side. Hi there, I am the Chief of U.S. Custom and Border Protection's FOIA Appeals Office. Although I am sure this statement may be met with some skepticism, we are constantly trying to improve our internal processes and relationship with requesters. What are some best practices that the panel would like to see more agencies implement? Preferably beyond give me more and give it to me faster. So who would like to jump in first?
I'd love to jump in. I think that's great. I'm really thank you for that question. For me, particularly with this particular agency, I'd love there to be more of a conversation, communication. Communication is really important. And I will note that DHS, some of the other components within DHS have been just actually very pleasant to deal with. So, I'm aware that this agency receives lots and lots of requests, particularly over the past 4 years. There's a backlog. Sometimes there's privacy issues that come up, but just having more communication with the requester. If there's a possibility to jump on a call, I do always appreciate when I get other agencies that say that ask me, because they do want to get me records quicker, or try to at least. And I know that the analysts are just trying to do their jobs by pushing these requests through. They're not the ones that are, trying to hold anything back. They want to get this through. So having a conversation, trying to guide me and how to, work with the agency. Maybe it should be, narrower. Just more of a communication would be incredibly helpful.
Can I just add on to that? And I would say I would encourage that person for sure. Connect with me, please. Kimbriell.Kelly@latimes.com. Because I'm in a space right now where I want to have these conversations, and I 100% agree with Jason. Like, there need to be conversations. It's almost like you're telling a person after they failed, okay, let's relitigate this. It's like, well, people don't want to fail to begin with. And so if we had some more information before we hit the failure button and before we had to go to an appeal, that would be better. But I feel like people are like Jason and myself, where we're trying to figure out what works. And so if there's any insight from the appeal side, yes, please tell us, because then we can tell, at least I can tell other reporters in my office. I have an entire bureau who would love to hear that intel about how to have more successful requests. I don't tell people that you're sending a public records request and you're just going to get the records. The goal is, how do you have successful requests, whatever that may look like? Sometimes you're not going to get everything you ask for. And I think the appeals folks and people who are doing what you're doing have some of those answers. And you can help us at the front end, but also in the appeals process. Secondly, I would just say, for the appeals process, oftentimes reporters, because they're not checking on this stuff every day, they miss the window for the appeals process. And so then they have to start all over again, or they have to backtrack and go to the public records custodian. And so I think that there's some miscommunication that happens there too, because then it's some email that went into spam and there's no real communication where the reporter really needed something and their time period is passed.
Yeah, I worked with a lawyer from DOJ. We privately tried to get agencies to do more negotiating, because what was happening was this: the New York Times would sue, BuzzFeed would sue, the LA Times would sue, and the AUSA comes in and becomes a mediator. Most of these FOIA cases settle because the AUSA has intervened and said, how about if we get you this, would that do it? And a lot of times we were able to say yes. And this DOJ attorney and I said, that is madness that you have to sue to get that kind of service. It's burdensome on DOJ, it's costly. Why not just have the agencies do that? And just underscoring the points that were made, I think if the agencies had that conversation, look at it as a way to negotiate to a resolution you can both live with, it's going to save everybody a lot of time.
Great.
Yeah, well,
And one last question. Gosh, we could, I think we could have a couple more hours talking about this. Let's see, one last question. What are resources available for journalists who want to push back on FOIA rejections, but can't get their station or news agency to provide legal help?
Well, one of the things I would suggest is that you look at the clinics that are popping up, the law school clinics that are popping up across the country. There's been funding of those from Yale, Duke, Cornell, across the country, UCLA, elsewhere. Reach out to them. Many times they can help. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press now has has a local journalism initiative. They have lawyers now stationed in 5 other states, but even at the Washington headquarters, they can help. And when you fail, you should always just FOIA either Kim or Jason's letters and just cut and paste, because they have made every possible argument you would ever want to make.
I would agree with that. I think Reporters Committee is a great asset. Other reporters, if you use a hashtag on Twitter, on FOIA, IRE, investigative reporters and editors, if you're a member, you can actually go and get the applications for all of the stories that they've published for the last several decades, I think the last 4 decades. And you can actually read what FOIA battles they had and how they were able to overcome them. And I feel like those are a lot of lessons learned. I also just want to point out that for Sunshine Week and for this panel today, I did wear a redacted t-shirt. So, and it through IRE, but I think that there's a lot of lessons learned. And I think people have a lot of resources out there to study how to do it. But sometimes the best medicine is talking to reporters who are doing it. Like, it's a very small universe. I know AP has a lot of reporters as well, but just being in that conversation, because they want to hear, all of us are learning tips and tricks from each other.
Yeah, so as Ellen said, this is fascinating. It is, first of all, it's been a tremendous honor to get to chat with all 3 of you. I know that the several hundred people that joined us today, based on the feedback from Q&A and all the activity on Twitter, are really enjoying this. I want to close out with giving you each basically a last word. And before we do, I do just want to thank everyone at Newhouse and the Newhouse events team. Were fantastic in putting this together and making the technology work and all of that. So thank you to them and to Dean Lodato as well. But my final question for each of you is, there are a lot of people who've joined us who are here at Newhouse School of Journalism, School of Public Communication, who are going into journalism. There are a lot of people on the call who are already working journalists and who are interested in making this more of their work, part of their work. And I wonder if we could just close out with a thought from each of you in terms of what the potential and the kind of note of encouragement. What were the possibilities of doing this, and what do we need to see in the field from new journalists who want to do this more as a part of their work? I'll start at the top with Kim, and we'll go Kim, David, and Jace again. So
Sure.
Last word.
Last year I taught a course on public records at Princeton University, and one of the things that I think was consistent is, be persistent, just be obsessed about these things, build a template for yourself so that you're only changing like the one bullet or the discrete thing that you're asking for, but make it as easy as possible for you. And just be flexible to make mistakes, realizing that they're not terminal, but that you have to be put on that path to have success.
I'm going to put in the pitch to think locally. There's the big, sexy national stories, and my 2 colleagues here, good representation of great work being done. But you know what? Local journalism is in a really bad way. And you'll find actually that local FOIA in many states works better. That where personal charm works, The documents are, there's nobody's ever going to tell you about national security. And there are so many great stories out there to do. So it's both a pitch for local journalism and for using state FOIL to get what you need.
I'm going to repeat what I said earlier, and that's approach FOIA as if it were, you were approaching a news story, or an investigative story, and think of it that way. At the same time, don't be discouraged. It's a battle, and I would also note that it would be really beneficial to the requester to try to file multiple requests per month or whatever bandwidth you have, so you can build a pipeline. That's how I started early on, is I built a pipeline, because after a year passed, I started getting a steady flow of records per week, and that has not ended for 10 years now. But within our newsroom, I share the records with our newsroom. I'm not just the only one who write stories off of it. It's a collaborative effort. But I think that is, a good way to start.
Yeah, thank you, each of you, for that. And I would say as well, follow the work of Jason, David, and Kimbriell. There are great stories coming out of these newspapers. We're lucky to have them. As David said, though, there's lots of potentials for work at the local level. If you're specifically interested in data through FOIA, feel free to check out TRAC's website, trac.syr.edu. That gives you a little bit of an idea of what a project looks like that's built around data that was obtained through FOIA. And we also have a project called the Foia Project, where we also track FOIA litigation in the federal courts. We go out every single day and we get updates on every single FOIA case that's in the federal courts. That's at foiaproject.org. And that's where you'll also find the report on news media and journalist litigation in federal courts. So hopefully that's a resource. There is a growing community, I can tell you, of journalists who are doing Freedom of Information Act requests and litigation as part of their work. So hopefully we can also use this event and going forward as building a bigger FOIA community and a bigger and better FOIA community. So thank you everyone on the panel for your time. Greatly appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you more work coming out of all of your newspapers.